Last week, after years of preparation and months of positioning troops along the border, the Russian government began special military operations in Ukraine, deploying the largest military land force since World War II, targeting and destroying civilian and military sites alike. In just 7 days, hundreds of Ukrainians have been killed as Russian forces have made their way to Ukraine's major cities. Over 1 million Ukrainians have left the country, taking whatever possessions they can carry with them. The Ukrainian people have shown incredible resolve in an almost unthinkable situation. Ordinary people with little or no military training are taking up arms to fight, standing guard over their homes, children, and country. In one case, hundreds of Ukrainians blocked the road to a nuclear plant in southern Ukraine to try and keep the Russians from accessing the plant. Those efforts failed, and we all watched in horror as fire erupted in the world's 4th largest nuclear plant. The flames remind us all how connected we are through death and through life. Across Russia, citizens from that country have shown incredible bravery in protesting the actions of their government, despite paying heavy penalties for doing so. Here in Ithaca, we are physically far removed from the war, but we have Cornell students, staff, faculty, and alumni who are from both Ukraine and Russia, or who have loved ones in the region. This is the most uncertain of times, with what is certainly gut-wrenching fear for family and friends in danger's path. We acknowledge and share in their sorrow. The current violence exposes the fragilities of the post-war experiment in pan-regional cooperation. It is also yet one more reminder of our shocking capacity for destruction, a capacity that is both ideological and technological. Those who perpetrate violent acts will always seek to rationalize them, to insist on the problematic nature of borders or past grievances or wounds aggravated by color, religion, or other differences. But these justifications are never acceptable reasons to enact mass death, and they should not distract us. As a wise colleague once said to me, when faced with competing justifications, we should choose life. It is life that is sacred, and when in doubt as to what is right or wrong or where to stand, we should choose life over death. We should support the right to live a dignified, self-directed life, what we might call the right to thrive, over the right to domination or violence. And as such, we condemn the invasion of Ukraine in the strongest terms. As a university, we can do certain things in a situation like this. We can educate ourselves about the history, the politics, and economics in the region. We can learn together, as we're doing today with the expert presentations in this panel. We can engage in our studies and in the world around us to make a meaningful difference. And as a community here in New York and around the world, we can stand together as a refuge and a bridge. As a community, we can take a stand for learning as the means to support the foundations of a better life. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. And thank you to Cornell University. Thank you to our co-sponsors, the College of Arts and Sciences and the Brooks School of Public Policy. On behalf of the Mario Einaudi Center for International Studies and our programs, the Institute for European Studies and the REPI Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies, thank you for joining us for this important conversation of experts. As we work together with our students, colleagues, and partners across the world to move ever closer towards justice and peace, our imperative is to use and share knowledge, to assess this new attack on rights, sovereignty, and peace with an eye to the history, to regional and global factors, and with expertise from a variety of perspectives. Our panelists today represent this breadth and depth with a deep knowledge of Russian and Ukrainian politics, international law and migration, economic sanctions, and European reactions and consequences. I will introduce each of our speakers now before opening it up to their comments. And I will take questions from the audience to pose to our panel, so please do use the Q&A function at any time throughout the session. Our first panelist today is Bryn Rosenfeld, an assistant professor of government and an editor at the Washington Post Monkey Cage, and a principal investigator of the 2021 Russian election study, a long-running academic study of Russian public opinion and voting behavior supported by the National Science Foundation. She's an expert on the politics of Russia, Ukraine, and other former Soviet countries. Her recent book, The Autocratic Middle Class, demonstrates how middle-class economic dependence on the state impedes democratization and contributes to authoritarian resilience. Our second panelist today is Dmitry Baikov, who is a Russian dissident and Open Society University Network Fellow and a visiting critic sponsored by Global Cornell and hosted by the Einaudi Center's Institute for European Studies in partnership with Ithaca City of Asylum. One of Russia's best-known public intellectuals, he is a novelist, poet, critic, and university professor. He is a 3-time winner of the Bolshana Kinga Big Book Award and one of Russia's most prestigious literary prizes, and has served as the host of numerous television and radio programs. Our next panelist is Cristina Floria, who is a historian of modern Europe, specializing in Eastern and Central Europe during the 19th and 20th century, and teaches on Soviet history, World War II, and the interwar period. Her work touches on the relationship between nationalism and empire in the region, as well as the centrality of imperial competition to East European politics and societies. She's finishing a book that traces a Ukrainian-Romanian borderlands experience of repeated regime change and transformation from the 18th century to the present. Mabel Berenson is a professor of sociology and the director of the Institute for European Studies. She writes on challenges to democratic cohesion and solidarity in Europe and the United States. Berenson is the author of Illiberal Politics in Neoliberal Times, Culture, Security, and Populism in the New Europe, and Making the Fascist Self, The Political Culture of Interwar Italy. Her next book is entitled The End of Security and the Rise of Populism, and examines the current global resurgence of nationalism and the populist challenge to democratic practice. Nicholas Mulder is an assistant professor of history and works on European and international history from 1870 to the present. An expert on financial sanctions, his recent book, The Economic Weapon, The Rise of Sanctions as a Tool of Modern War, provides a history of the interwar origins of economic sanctions, showing how they reconfigured international affairs by enabling distant coercion against civilian societies and elites. His current project, The Age of Confiscation, is an international history of expropriation. And finally, Stephen Yale Lair is a professor of immigration law practice at Cornell Law School and a faculty fellow with Cornell's Migrations Initiative. He is also co-author of Immigration Law and Procedure, the leading 21-volume immigration law treatise published by LexisNexis, and he is also counsel at the Miller-Mayer law firm in Ithaca. Bryn, we'll begin with your comments. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rachel, for that kind introduction, and to Global Cornell and the Einaudi Center for sponsoring this panel. As we know, last Monday, Russia began a massive invasion of Ukraine, having massed over preceding months, some estimates to 190,000 troops from as far away as Russia's Eastern Military District, on Ukraine's northern, eastern, and southern borders. Now, some week into the invasion, it's clear that Russia has faced stiffer than expected opposition in Ukraine. And so I wanted to share with you some thoughts based on my work and knowledge of public opinion and in Ukraine and in Russia on this question. So the Kremlin, as has been widely observed, has seemed to make a variety of optimistic assumptions, including that it would face less resistance than it has. in its invasion of Ukraine. That Ukrainians, and particularly Eastern Ukrainians, would be more supportive seems to have been one of the operating assumptions of this campaign. In fact, there was strong national identity across all of Ukraine's regions. That is not just in Kyiv, not just in the center of the country, and not just in the western part of the country, but also in eastern and in southern Ukraine. And that is true in the predominantly Russian-speaking areas. And this was the case even before Russia annexed Crimea. It was true before the conflict began in Donbass some 8 years ago. Right? So large majorities, according to several academic studies, including one by co-authors of mine, Grigol Elikas at Princeton and Graham Robertson at UNC, considered their home Ukraine. And those majorities got even larger after Russian aggression in 2014. So it was not the case that Ukrainians in Russian-speaking areas were to welcome Russian troops in the way perhaps that they expected. Even in Donbass, the area of eastern Ukraine that has been under dispute with Russian-backed separatists over these last 8 years, the picture is very telling. Another academic survey by John O'Loughlin, Gwen Sassy, and Gerard Toll, a survey that was conducted along the line of control in Donbass, and this was in the days just before Putin invaded. About half in both the Kyiv, that is Ukrainian government-controlled areas, and in the DNR and LNR controlled territories, that's the territories that were held by Russian-backed separatists, said that they were indifferent about which flag flew overhead so long as they had economic opportunities. This, I think, is really striking. You'll recall, of course, that Russia has framed this so-called special military operation, but in fact this war, as a protection of those same people from genocide, as liberation of those people from under the boot of Kyiv's occupation, an occupation they've said called a Nazi occupation. And so this kind of indifference, this lack of an embrace of Russian control among the very people living in Donbass just gives you, I think, a very real sense, whether of miscalculation born of ignorance or the true scale of the lie required to prosecute this war. I think it's also the case that Russia miscalculated because it saw Zelensky as a weak leader, because they thought that Ukrainians' disaffection with his leadership and disgust at years of official corruption in Ukraine would earn their effort at regime change more sympathy. It is true that since Zelensky's landslide victory, his support has tanked badly. Many in Ukraine's elite, described him as a clown. And even on the eve of the invasion, the polling confirmed that most Ukrainians since the election had withdrawn their support. His ratings were very low. But today, of course, Ukrainians have rallied to their president in a way that was hard to imagine before the war. Ukrainians, including in Russian-speaking areas of the East, have not welcomed Russian efforts to, as Russia has described, hand the country back over to the people. There were instead enough, as Wendy alluded to actually in her opening remarks, to stop a column of tanks, and scream obscenities at them and in Russian. Right, so that last point brings me to what the war's domestic consequences are in Russia. A survey I ran as part of a long-running academic study of public opinion and elections in Russia showed that in December, even as troop buildup was well underway, Russians did not want an expanded conflict in Ukraine. Fewer than 10% wanted to see Russia send either troops or arms into eastern Ukraine, and that was true not only of those who supported Putin, or who had voted for his party in Russia's September elections. It was true also of people who had voted for the most prominent opposition parties, even those aligned with the Kremlin, the communists, and even the nationalists. And so after 8 years, people were tired of the conflict. Support for direct Russian intervention in the conflict had been declining, and that was true, again, across society. And so hence why Russia calls this a special military operation, a term we have to reject, right, and not a war. There was no great effort to prepare the Russian people, no great effort to prepare those who were going to fight. I mean, the troops who were sent believing that they were taking part in military exercises, not to mention the ordinary soldiers and particularly the conscripts doing mandatory military service who never expected to find themselves in a war zone. Just before the invasion, there were not yet the hallmarks of a kind of propaganda surge like the one that preceded Russia's annexation of Crimea. Right? So from the first night of the invasion, state TV had insisted that Ukraine would be returned to the Ukrainian people, that it would be returned sovereign and democratic. But the idea that Ukraine and Russia are one state is not popular with most Russians, and it is not popular with Russia's foreign policy establishment. Right? And the Kremlin's message about the war appears keyed to that, to Russians' opposition to joining Ukraine with Russia. The belief that they should have friendly relations, but that Ukraine should be independent. But that's, of course, not enough. And I'll stop here. As of this week, if you've not followed along, alternative sources of news are all but gone in Russia. TV Rain, its most prominent independent broadcaster, has shut down operations. Echo Moskwy, Echo of Moscow, the most prominent independent radio station, has shut down under threats by the Russian regulator, and a new draft law that would criminalize false reporting on the war and put prison sentences of up to 15 years for people who are convicted, passed a committee vote in Russia's State Duma earlier this week. Right, so there are, at least for now, other ways that information gets through. Russians have friends and family members in Ukraine, and unlike the other places where Russia has recently fought wars, in Chechnya and in Syria, this war is not with dark-skinned Muslims, where the Kremlin's war efforts, the benefit of a degree of racism and xenophobia and amongst ordinary people. This is a war with Slavs, and many Russians still have access to perspectives across the border. What they do with it, given the very sharp repressive turn, and particularly in this last week, is uncertain. I'll stop on that somber note.
Thank you so much, Bryn. And with that, we have the next, we'll move to Dimitri. Thank you.
Is everything okay with connection? Can you hear me? Thank you. Let's begin. Maybe it'll take 6 minutes. I think in wartime, most topics become insignificant, except only two: the situation at the field of the battle and the causes of the war. That is literally the traditional Russian proverb, how did we get to this abyss? One is important in order to determine your position as much as possible. The second is not to repeat it. The situation on our fronts is changing every second, and I am not sufficiently aware of it, but I have observed the formation of Russian fascism, or as you call it, Russism. I saw it directly, and I can tell you enough about it, being intimately familiar at one time with most of its ideologists at the time when they were still capable for discussion and did respond to any claims with their loud bark. In my humble opinion, fascism was not political or geopolitical, but moral reasons, and politics itself is nothing but a concentrated expression of national psychology. There were two reasons, two trends for the current events in Russia. On the one hand, the progressive madness of the authorities. On the other, the progressive helplessness of society. In other words, after the premiere of Lev Tolstoy's play The Power of Darkness, and this, let me remind you, happened in 1895, Vladimir Gilerovsky, after spending a sleepless night on the streets of Moscow, formulated, there are two misfortunes in Russia, the power of darkness at the top and the darkness of power at the bottom. So в России две напасти, внизу власть тьмы, вверху тьма власти. Let's start with the history of the progressive madness of the government and its ideologists, that is, with the idea of national exclusivity. It has embedded in Russian minds since the last decade of the reign of Nicholas I, when the so-called Slavophile movements became the official ideology. Oddly enough, Gogol was the first to see the danger in his most incomprehensible book, Selected Places from My Correspondence. There he wrote literally the following. They all talk about two different sides of the same subject, not realizing in any way that they do not argue at all and don't contradict each other. One has come too close to the building so that he sees only one part of it, the other has moved away from it so far, and that he sees the entire facade, but not the parts of it. Every philosophy exists mainly to justify the current state of things. Slavophilism, whose history was described in detail by the recently deceased Alexander Yanov, was intended to justify Russian isolationism, absolutism, lack of political rights, and the inhibition of historical development. By the middle of the 19th century, this lack was already fatal. Political rights of the population were negligible, and the scale of repression was unprecedented. The so-called gloomy 7 years, the last period of Nicholas' reign, from the French Revolution till Crimean War, was characterized by a complete halt in Russian cultural and social life, maybe a total absence of cultural life at all, dominance of censorship, lack of prospects of future. The death of Nicholas allowed belated reforms to be carried out, but they, as always, turned to be half of the necessary reforms, and Russian history shows that half-hearted reforms are the shortest path to unleashing terror. And this terror in 1881 ended what the reformers could not do. The attempts of the monarchs to stop the revolution only led to a civil war, which in 1922 brought to power the most unscrupulous and cynical regime, Bolsheviks, so-called, who were already resolutely ready to stop at nothing. The ideas of national messianism in Russia were most clearly expressed by Ivan Ilyin, the ideologist of Russian fascism, that is a kind of paramilitary theocracy. It is deeply no coincidence that German fascism aroused his interest and approval, and Ilyin loved it, not only as a way to stop communism, but also to continue the so-called white movement and Eurasian movement. It's also very significant that Ilyin's main opponent, Dmitry Merezhkovsky, accepted awards and grants from Mussolini's hands. That is, in this case, the extremes were converged. It's also very sad that in Russia, at the end of the 40s of the 20th century, the ideas of national exclusivity prevailed again in the times of the late Stalinism, and we can read, for example, in Eugene Dobrenko's monography. The framework of late Stalinism was the following. Europe showed us its true face. This face turned out to be fascist, and now we must once and for all abandon everything European. Russia insisted on its primacy in science, culture, religion, morality, and so on. She became infected with fascism to such an extent that she received her own anti-Semitic campaign, which lasted 5 years and almost ended with a mass expulsion of Jews to Siberia and Far East. The Purim of 1953, March 5th, stopped this threat. Many are impatiently awaiting Purim 2022, which falls on March 16th, but I suspect that the scale of the evil we are facing today is much greater and the threat is much larger. They correlate roughly like an atomic bomb and H bomb. The peculiarity of Russian development is that Slavophilism, the idea of national exclusivity, has become a mass nationwide ideology from the state ideology. The reason for this is not only the exceptional scale of casualties and destruction during the Second World War II, victims that have been avoided with different directions, for example, and with different government. But I must say that now we have the cult of majority. The growing understanding of Russian isolation from the rest of the world means now that all the world is in a kind of total battle against Russian spiritual might. We won because we were capable of the greatest sacrifice in the World War II. The dead are somehow better than the living. They are more loyal, more manageable. Everyone feels guilty in front of them. And so we have the real cult of death. Necrophilia, as Fromm called it. The dead are really much better than the living. And in Russia, the power of the dead has actually been established. It's not by chance, but that Petronius back in the era of Nero called death joining the majority. The cult of majorities established in Russia just means the cult of death. And in this sense, the cult of old age, characteristic of the Brezhnev era, the so-called gerontophilia, was a natural development of the cult of military victory. Today, under Putin, it has reached an unprecedented scale. Perhaps the Russians are in no hurry to protest because they're not afraid of any sanctions. They consider themselves partly already dead. And maybe this confirms Fromm's old thought about necrophilia as the state ideology of the Nazism. Modern Russia is a living illustration of Fromm's work on Hitler as a necrophile. You don't have to be German in general to become a reference necrophile. The gap between Russia and the rest of the world now, yes, if I should be shorter, I can stop just now, but I think that, just a minute.
Thank you, Dmitry. We'll come back to you in the next set of questions, and we'll have time for all of the panelists to respond to one another.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you so much. And next, we will move to Christina Floria.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you to the Einaudi Center and everyone really for putting this together. I guess, well, I'm a historian, right, of Eastern Europe, and specifically I work on this borderland area in Ukraine. So I thought I would bring some of a historian's perspective to this. And what's most striking for me ever since this war began is how history has been used repeatedly by both sides, how all these competing narratives have emerged about the origins of the war, how far back we should go, basically, and trying to identify the roots of this Russian-Ukrainian antagonism and so on. Now, there's a short-term story here, the short-term timeline, which is December 17, Russia issues an ultimatum to the West, demanding basically a commitment in writing that NATO would not expand any further east, and that all multinational NATO troops be removed from the Baltic states and from Poland, which NATO finds unacceptable. Then, February 24, Putin launches this invasion of Ukraine. And the justification that he offers, along with this claim that this is a response to NATO's refusal, basically, to back off, is that this is essentially an attempt to reunify Russia with their brothers, Ukraine. And from there, he also makes the argument that Ukrainians and Russians are actually not two distinct nationalities, right? As history shows, and it seems like history has become his hobby, especially during the pandemic, where he's been collecting archival documents and basically taking on the mantle of a historian to prove that basically these are one and the same people, which justifies this aggression against Ukraine. Ukrainians are basically not entitled to a sovereign state of their own. In addition to that, he's been making arguments about the Ukrainian government being essentially a collection of neo-Nazis, right, and fascists, and using the rhetoric that is derived basically from World War II and the interwar period of anti-fascism that he's trying to update now to a contemporary era. And so in relation to this, I just want to make a few very brief points about things that I find really interesting about this. One, the story of Ukraine's relationship with Russia, right, over the long term is very complicated. And what I see happening during this crisis is an attempt to impose or to transpose, in addition to just falsification, to transpose these contemporary notions of ethnicity or nationhood even to early modern period, or very, very early times where these did not apply. A lot of the conflict, I guess, revolves, in addition to the strategic considerations and so on the symbolic importance of Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, to this idea of a Russian nation that is primarily Orthodox, and that, according to this 19th century idea, was a kind of tripartite entity that included both Ukrainians and Belarusians and Russians together. And so several dates, I'm particularly actually impressed with this one map that was shown on Russian television at one point after Putin's speech, which basically called Ukraine a gift, right, of the Tsars and the Bolsheviks and so on, and then proceeded to fragment it, kind of showing that contemporary Ukraine's borders are essentially not of its own making, but are a gift of Russia. And the three dates that this map referred to, or that keep being brought up in these debates, are 1654, which is the date where this Ukrainian leader, Hetman Bogdan Khmelnytsky, basically appealed to Russia for protection for the Orthodox population that was at that time under Polish rule. Signed this treaty, and in retrospect, this treaty, which established suzerainty, Russia's suzerainty over these territories, was reinterpreted as Ukrainians willingly joining Russia. That was followed by a war between Poland and Russia, which resulted in the division of the Ukrainian lands into what is now referred to as left bank Ukraine and right bank Ukraine, which then ended up having very different development. In one of them, Ukrainian national consciousness emerged and developed under Polish rule, under Austrian rule later. In the other one, it did so under Russian rule. Here, another interesting date that was brought up, again, is 1922, and the argument there is made that various pieces of contemporary Ukraine were gifted to the state by Lenin, right? And so this is, the Ukrainian state is essentially a Bolshevik creation. This argument has also been made. And here, again, just really briefly, wanted to say that there are multiple Ukrainian states that emerged before Lenin showed up on the scene. As soon as the Russian Empire began disintegrating in 1917 in response to the Bolshevik Revolution in October, one autonomous, basically, Ukrainian state emerged that proceeded to declare its independence from the Bolshevik or from Russia in January 1918, but was then conquered, basically invaded by the Bolsheviks, and then incorporated into what would become the Soviet Union, which had this federal structure. The other date that appears on this map is 1954, when Ukraine was awarded Crimea again by Khrushchev. And here the argument is Crimea, therefore, should return to Russia. And to this, what I have to say, again, is that if this same logic, this goes back to what Wendy was mentioning in her speech before, right? If this same logic is applied to every European state at this point, we would end up dismantling basically the whole world order, the whole international system as it is. Because here, what you see Putin essentially doing in all these speeches is mixing and matching basically pieces of this place's extremely complicated history to justify what is essentially an act of aggression now. What I would also say very briefly and then stop is this whole conflict really needs to be understood against the background of the Soviet Empire's dissolution, and as one manifestation of that process, which is still ongoing. And about that, guess one thing that we should think about is the Soviet Union was really the only modern empire that really just imploded. It kind of fell apart, arguably from within, without a massive amount of violence, right, or any kind of world war happening. But as we see, what happened then in 1991, I think, was not the end of the story. What we're dealing now with in Ukraine is in many ways a kind of continuation of this process of basically imperial collapse and attempts at resurgence, basically, of recreating a kind of Russian sphere of influence on the model, perhaps, of what Stalin was doing at Yalta, really, in 1945. Maybe I will stop here, and then I'll be happy to answer questions about this.
Fantastic, Christina. Thank you so much. Next, we'll go to Mabel Berenson.
Okay. I will try to be as fast as possible. First of all, I want to thank my colleagues at Einaudi Institute for organizing this event. I was in France last week on February 24th, a Thursday. That's an important date, when Russia began the invasion of the Ukraine. By the weekend, the Parisian monuments, the Eiffel Tower, the Place de Bastille were awash in blue and gold lighting, and the rallies of support and demonstration against Putin began. And in fact, this was not unique to France. It was all over the world, more or less. A French colleague of mine told me Europe changed last weekend. And by last weekend, I literally mean a week ago. But as I was looking last night at the horrific images on the US cable news, I was forced to ask myself what changed in Europe. Was Europe finally acting as a coherent geopolitical space? And I should warn you, when I use the word Europe, I'm aligning it with EU. So it's not totally precise in that way if you're looking for precision, but it is the two of them. And since my charge here is to speak about the relationship between this event in the Ukraine and Europe, I'm going to actually point to four things which I think are important to keep in mind as we move forward and as we see what Europe actually does or does not do. I'll shorten this as best I can, but axiomatic to, this is point one, axiomatic to post-war European culture was the idea that Europe acting collectively would never let an atrocity such as World War II with the Nazi regime happen again. And this was embedded in a lot of political doctrines, such as the 1948 UN Human Rights Accords, the 1951 European Doctrine of Human Rights, which basically guaranteed the right to asylum. Jumping ahead about 30, 40 years, actually jumping to 2015, the European Union, the expanded European Union, hasn't been doing a very good job of handling these crises and engaging or acting out its self-image as a sort of bastion of collective identity and human rights. So if you think of the refugee crisis in 2015, the terror crisis, the sovereign debt crisis. Maintaining an ideal of oneself without efficient institutional arrangement was passable as long as threats were indirect and not in geopolitical proximity. Now, Ukraine is part of Europe and it's geographically proximate. So the question that I would think we need to look at and think about here is, to what extent will the Ukraine pose a unique challenge to what has constituted European, or perhaps more accurately, EU self-institutional identity? I can talk about that if anyone wants to later. But point two, the current crisis seemed to be the place for European collective action. As Carl Schmitt famously noted, friends versus enemies are the basis of political cohesion. And it would seem that Putin provided a collective enemy that every European nation state could and would oppose, a political opportunity for one to act as one Europe, the Europe that was envisioned way back in the early 50s when the EU was not the EU then, was coming into being. Last weekend, not even a week ago, it seemed like that something like this was occurring. Extraordinary things occurred. Germany actually basically rechanged its foreign policy. It basically rearmed. Sweden committed troops. Switzerland, that's not even part of EU, abandoned its longstanding neutrality and said it was going to cut off financial dealings with Russia. And Putin was, for better or worse, thrown out of the Council of Europe. And the EU itself acted as a unit. And this was a unique thing for it to do. And I know we'll hear about sanctions in the next talk, but it instituted financial sanctions against Russian banks. It wasn't going to allow SWIFT payments. There was supposed to be a no-fly zone across the EU for Russian aircraft. It banned Russian broadcasters. It promised to finance weapons for Ukrainian fighters. Endpoint of point 2 here, by the end of this week, the collective action or political will to act as one interest group seems to be waning. It is clear that there is a limit to how far the EU will go with its economic sanctions that violate the interests of particular nation states. This has always been the weak point in European Union, European integration. For example, yesterday, the German economic minister said that Germany would not agree to an import ban on Russian gas and oil and coal because that would endanger social peace in Germany, an interesting way of phrasing it. And it is starting to look less than a week later like EU is going back to business as usual. So that's point 2. Point 3, there are 2 very important elections coming up in Europe. In April, the French presidential election and the Hungarian election on April 3rd. Both Viktor Orban and Marine Le Pen, who had courted Putin, in fact, to get money for their campaigns, suddenly a week ago backed away from Putin and said his actions in the Ukraine were outrageous. Not clear what that will actually do. It'll change the balance of the narrative, but it probably won't change the outcome of these elections. And the 4th point that I do want to quickly mention is the Achilles heel in this whole thing is European energy policy. It is not only Germany that is dependent on Russia for energy, and this is going to be one of the problems. It will limit the extent of punitive measures. So basically, I think to end on a happy note, given how the week has progressed so far, Europeans need to do more than light their monuments in blue and yellow. Thank you.
Thank you, Mabel. And next to Nicholas Mulder.
Yes, thank you very much to the organizers, Global Cornell and the Einaudi Center for putting this panel together. So I want to also speak here a little bit about the sanctions response and the economic picture of this conflict, which is not actually something that affects just Russia and Ukraine or even just Russia and Europe, but is already affecting the entire world. And there's 3 main points that I'd like to discuss. First, the unity of the response, which has been striking. Secondly, the goals of the sanctions, which I think is actually an important topic of discussion that we should be speaking more about than we are. And third, possible effects and possible scenarios for how they might play out. Mabel just now already gave us a very good, I think, overview of the unity of the response, which has been impressive. Since early December, as the Russian buildup was gathering steam, there had already been very overt threats from Western leaders, both from the Biden administration and from European leaders, that there would be sanctions, severe and major sanctions were the words used by Biden, if Putin would undertake aggression against Ukraine. And on February 24th, it became necessary to make good on those threats. And one thing important that we should note, first of all, is that the deterrent, so the actual hope that sanctions would deter an invasion, didn't work. And that brought us into a new situation where we've actually had to impose them. And that then forces pretty difficult choices about what to do. Ordinarily, I think many of us would have expected that this would take time, particularly with the European Union, a 27-country coalition of states. But actually what we've seen is an incredibly rapid response, a really rapid coming together of these countries, and not just the United States, the European Union, Britain, Canada, and G7 countries, but also some of the sanctions measure even include significant Asian economies. So Japan, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan have joined the Western high-tech embargo against Russia, which will have a significant effect in cutting off the access of the Russian armed forces to high-tech components, semiconductors, these sorts of things. And in the medium to long term, that will definitely, I think, degrade their ability to operate in Ukraine. But the second point that I'd like to make is that the goals of these sanctions have remained somewhat unclear. The EU statement last week on Thursday, within 24 hours after the invasion of the initial package of sanctions, said that the three core things that the sanctions were meant to achieve were to end the fighting, lead to a Russian withdrawal from the territory of Ukraine, and Russian respect for the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Since then, however, there have been a raft of new sanctions imposed, particularly on Saturday, when the G7 Western countries took the radical step of not only cutting off a large number of Russian financial institutions from the SWIFT, that's a financial messaging network that ties together the global financial system. They cut them off from SWIFT, but they also froze the majority of the Russian central bank's foreign exchange reserves. This has now caused a serious collapse in the ruble. It sent the Russian economy into an acute financial crisis. And the consequences of that are also not severe, not just for ordinary Russians, but also for Central Asia. So many economies there are quite closely tied to Russia, have migrant laborers who work in Russia and have currencies closely tied to the ruble. So already these sanctions, they were much heavier and more severe than expected, are having significant economic effects in the region. And the goals there become important because the initial goals were clear, but since then there hasn't been actually a clear set of demands. And now I think, given that there's been an enormous and very understandable and justified public opinion mobilization in support of Ukraine, which is in many ways impressive and admirable, there is also now a cacophony and a multitude of demands being made. And there's actually uncertainty about what the aim of these sanctions is supposed to be. Some people, a kind of maximal interpretation is that the aim is actually to end Putin's rule in Russia. A more minimal aim would maybe be that there should be a ceasefire and that there should be an end to fighting. And somewhere in the middle would be an aim that Russia would have to withdraw. But that's a very large spectrum. And making it clear where exactly, what sort of demands on that spectrum Western sanctions are tied to is really vital, because that could be the difference between this war dragging on for months and even years and us achieving a ceasefire which will protect civilians and give us an opportunity to reach negotiated settlements. So clarity about the goals is vital. And historical experience particularly also shows that if sanctions don't work quickly and if they don't have clear demands, they're likely to become permanent. They lead to a sort of ossified structure, and they reinforce oftentimes the antagonism and the enmity between countries. So making those clear sanctions demands, I think, is the most important thing right now that we can do. We already have quite severe sanctions to make these work. And one easy thing would be, for example, to say that the demand would be an end to fighting, and a limited withdrawal would lead to the lifting of central bank sanctions. A further withdrawal would lead to a reinstatement of SWIFT links, and a total withdrawal, including allowing, for example, a federal structure for Ukraine, would lead to taking back a technology embargo, these sorts of things. So making a very gradated, steps-wise procedure for de-escalation. The final point that I'd like to make is about possible effects. Now, we've already seen pretty significant short-term effects now on the Russian economy just this week. And there, the trick, and this is really the difficulty with sanctions, is to transform economic damage into the political outcomes that we want, which is, again, why being clear about the political goals is vital. It is actually very difficult to make this work. The majority of sanctions in history do not work, and sanctions with very sweeping and maximal aims tend to work even less than sanctions with limited aims. So one thing to keep in mind here is to see whether the Russian economy makes it through this initial shock and how it adjusts. And if there are signs of popular anti-war movements that were initially encouraging last week, of course, there's been, as Professor Rosenfeld noted, a big repressive turn since. But if there's a possibility for some of this shock to link up with some of those popular demands, then that might be a beneficial development. On the other hand, if that is not there, and if in the next few weeks we do not see things moving in that direction, then it is likely that the sanctions actually will not necessarily work. Again, we reach a situation of stasis. That also will entail very grave consequences for the world economy. So already we can see an enormous surge in the price of commodities on world markets. Major commodity indices now are up about 20%, but it's quite likely that the price of oil will end at $180 a barrel or higher at the end of this year without Russian supply. So there's a very high chance that the world is going to enter a major recession this year. And I don't want to end on too dim a note, but I'll be happy to take more questions about possibilities from here on out. But we're in a very difficult situation. History gives us some guide about what to expect, but frankly, we're just in uncharted territory because no one has ever tried to impose sanctions this severe on an economy the size of Russia's.
Thank you so much, Nick. A lot of food for thought and connection to the prior presentations as well. Last but not least, Steve Yeller.
Thank you. I've been asked to speak about the humanitarian and immigration aspects of the war in Ukraine. As Wendy pointed out, more than 1 million Ukrainians have already fled to neighboring countries, according to the United Nations, and 1 million more are internally displaced. Russia and Ukraine have agreed, supposedly, on establishing humanitarian corridors with the possibility of ceasefires to allow civilians to evacuate. If those humanitarian corridors happen, the United Nations anticipates that more than 4 million other Ukrainians will leave the country shortly, and they'll need protection and assistance in the coming months. European Union policymakers are organizing an unprecedented response to this humanitarian crisis. They have approved the first ever activation of something they call the Temporary Protection Directive that will provide displaced Ukrainians in Europe immediate protection and rights for up to 3 years. This will reduce pressures on individual national asylum systems and enhance responsibility sharing. But we don't know how this temporary protection directive will work in practice and how it will be rolled out, particularly as European asylum agencies and migration authorities will face a range of operational challenges. For example, the EU will need to set up a new process to register people and also organize which agencies and funding mechanisms will assure adequate reception and emergency assistance. In the medium term, populations fleeing Ukraine will need access to affordable housing, education, the labor market, and healthcare. How can European countries who already have tight housing markets and overburdened healthcare systems plan for the needs of those displaced by the war in Ukraine? These are questions that European countries are facing. I also want to point out that while the number of displaced Ukrainians is high, let's not forget other refugee hotspots. Worldwide, 84 million individuals have been forcibly displaced because of persecution, conflict, violence, or human rights violations. We are now witnessing the highest levels of displacement on record. Of that 84 million, 51 million people are internally displaced in their own countries. The other 33 million are refugees, meaning they have fled their own countries to another country. For example, there are 13.5 million displaced Syrians, representing more than half of Syria's total population. 6.8 million Syrians are hosted in 128 countries around the world. Similarly, there are 2.6 million registered Afghan refugees in the world, and another 3.5 million Afghans internally displaced in their country. So our international refugee system is reeling from all these crises and wars. The war in Ukraine is simply the most recent. So 3 things. What is the US doing? What is Cornell doing? And what can you do? Well, the US government yesterday issued something called temporary protected status for Ukrainians. That means that they will be protected from deportation for 18 months and they can get work permits. Individuals eligible for temporary protected status must have entered the United States before March 1st. An estimated 30,000 Ukrainians in the United States might benefit from this temporary protected status designation. But temporary protected status does not help Ukrainians trying to get to the United States. For Ukrainians, there are several immigration options under existing law, but none of the visa options are easy or quick. First, there's the refugee process. This year, the United States has said it will admit up to 125,000 people around the world. But given the number of total refugees in the world, getting categorized as a refugee from Ukraine doesn't do much for you. And even if an individual can show a well-founded fear of persecution to qualify as a refugee, the process is very backlogged. It can take years to actually get to the United States as a refugee. Second is asylum. If you're in the United States as a Ukrainian, you can try to apply for asylum, but you have to show a well-founded fear of persecution. And like the refugee process, qualifying for asylum is hard, and the process is very backlogged. We know this all too well from the asylum clinic that I direct at Cornell Law School. A third option is humanitarian parole. US relatives and friends can apply for Ukrainians to get humanitarian parole to come to the United States temporarily. But that's also very backlogged. For example, 43,000 people from Afghanistan applied for humanitarian parole after the fall of the government there 6 months ago, but only a few hundred have been approved so far. The fourth option is to apply for a regular visa, like a tourist visa, for example, or to come to Cornell to study as a student. But people need to get a visa to do that. There are no visa services in Ukraine, so people need to leave Ukraine first to apply for a visa. And most visa applicants could well be denied because they can't prove that they intend to return to the Ukraine after their stay in the United States. What is Cornell doing? Well, Cornell has signed a letter with over 170 other universities asking the US government to grant temporary protected status and special student relief for Ukrainian students living in the United States. If that is granted, that would help Ukrainian international students at Cornell and elsewhere regarding their duration of status, how many courses they have to take, and their work eligibility. Finally, what you can do? Well, you, the audience, can donate money to refugee organizations like the International Rescue Committee or the International Refugee Assistance Project. You can also write your members of Congress to urge them to spend more money on international refugee assistance worldwide. And finally, you can write your members of Congress to try to increase the number of refugees that the US will admit. Back to you, Rachel.
Thank you so much, Steve, and to each of our panelists who have so much to share here. We've been getting a number of really excellent and interesting questions from our audience, so I'm going to move straight to those. I'm going to ask you all a number of questions, and then because we don't have much time left, you'll each get 1 minute to give a single response to the question of your choosing. So thanks to the audience for putting some great questions in. The first question is there still hope for a way for Russia to climb down and not continue this war? Can we imagine a pathway? And I think, Nick was speaking to this in some senses, but for others who want to chime in as well. Second, when Ukraine gave up its Soviet-era nuclear weapons, it was guaranteed by both the US and Russia territorial and political sovereignty. Why is the US not obligated now to defend Ukraine militarily? Third question, about NATO expansion. Tom Friedman recently wrote in the New York Times article, "This is Putin's war, but America and NATO aren't innocent bystanders." Could you discuss the politics of NATO expansion during the 1990s and the exclusion of Russia? Should NATO have proceeded differently? Finally, I wanted to bring up one of the points that Dmitry had noted in an earlier conversation about the way in which this invasion unites Ukrainians potentially in a sense of nationhood vis-a-vis an external invasion. And of course, there are many unknowns about the course of this war, but perhaps for Christina or for Dmitry, what's your sense of how the cohesion of the nation is shaped? So please feel free to respond to these or take up one other point that you would like to do in response to your co-panelists. Dr. Rosenfeld, we'll begin with you.
Mute myself first. Thank you for the terrific engagement from the audience. And so I'll take up the question of NATO expansion very briefly, although I'm not an expert on Russian foreign policy or NATO in particular. What I want to note, and this is in implicit response to a kind of realist perspective that has been out there, in the public debate about whether stepping back from NATO expansion towards Russia's borders during the 1990s is at fault here, and whether Ukraine should have preemptively declared itself neutral in all of this. And my grave fear here is that Russia never saw Ukraine, and it is very clear, both in its domestic messaging on this and in Putin's statements on the conflict, never saw Ukraine as an independent actor in this. It sees Ukraine as an instrument of the United States, as an instrument of the West. And so Ukraine's, quote, capitulation to an independent, neutral status would have been seen as a successful effort to blackmail the United States and countries along Russia's border in Central and Eastern Europe, of course, know how that story ends. It is not a promise and assurance that Russia could give to stop with Ukraine, even had that step been taken.
Thank you, Bryn. Dimitri.
Saying briefly, the war will come back from Ukraine to Russia and will be transformed into civil war. Maybe that's the only way to awake Russia, which is totally suppressed by the so-called psychology of underground, like Dostoevsky called it. The underground philosophy means that you believe in nothing and that your main joy is humiliation. Only after awakening of most people in Russia, you can get the free country. But civil war is necessary. Russia tried to make it in Ukraine, but Ukraine appeared to be much more united. So we'll get it again, and the result is unpredictable.
Thank you very much. Christina.
Thank you. I'm about to explode, really. I don't really know which question to take. I'm kind of pondering. I think I'm going to take the NATO one, and then if there's time left, I will go to the one about Ukrainian nationhood. I wanted to echo what Bryn said. I completely agree with that. And I think in a lot of these realist conversations about the role of NATO's expansion and all this, actually the agency of local actors tends to be forgotten. NATO's expansion was not really a military invasion, right? In the 1990s and 2004, multiple states that had been part of the Warsaw Pact or that had been Soviet satellites like Romania, Poland, the Baltic states, aggressively actually sought integration into NATO as a way of guaranteeing territorial integrity and sovereignty after the Soviet Union's collapse. So that's one side of this. The other side, I think that actually, I mean, while I understand where this perspective comes from, I think that in fact it places too much or puts America too much at the center of what is going on here and overlooks that there's actually an internal dynamic also going on here. Russia also has ambitions of its own, and it has had them before America was even present, really, in Europe. And there's a complicated backdrop to all this about what Ukraine means to Russia, how Russians have seen it. It's also about Ukraine and Russia, in addition to NATO and all of this stuff, right, that a lot of people have emphasized. And I think that's really important to take into account. Maybe I'll take the other question later if we have time, because I have thoughts about that, but this is briefly my answer to this.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Christina. Mabel.
Well, I'm interested in the question of cohesion, but not necessarily the cohesion within Ukraine, although in general, basically any kind of an attack is likely to build that kind of cohesion. But what concerns me is I'm not so optimistic about the cohesion that I see operating in Europe, either with regard to immigration policy, which we've already heard takes a long time, refugee policy to actually operationalize, and also with regard to the sanctions. Now, I'm not an expert on sanctions, so I defer to anyone. I certainly defer to Nicholas on that regard. But I'm already seeing backing away. I mean, this would have been the moment for Europe to finally sort of really come together in a much deeper and thicker way than it has so far. And I mean, I don't think the answer is in yet, but I am concerned about what I'm seeing. And if Europe can't act together, then, forget the United States, because as Christina just said, the United States isn't there. We're over here. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Mabel. Nicholas.
Yeah, I think I might say a few words to the climb down question. And despite not being any kind of expert on Putin, so I'll try and comment it from a kind of more general comparative way at what sort of dynamic could potentially lead to de-escalation and bring in the sanctions element again. I think one thing that's important to realize is that we've ended up imposing these sanctions also very much because we lack a good alternative. Biden and a large part of the West, right? The discussion about NATO is in some sense moot, because I think even if there had been a possibility of that, Ukraine is still, in the optimistic scenario, many years away from entry. And so NATO is somewhat also has been brought into this discussion, but perhaps is a bit more tangential to it. And it was already very clear, even in December, when Biden issued the first sanctions threats, that there was not going to be direct military intervention by the West in Ukraine to assist them. And I think also, right, there have been calls in the last week to establish a no-fly zone to protect Ukraine from Russian air attack. That too is a measure that would really escalate the conflict, because it requires you to shoot down all Russian aircraft. So that would lead to direct military engagement between the West and Russia. For all of those reasons, I think people have come to vest a lot of hopes in sanctions. And sanctions are an extremely imperfect instrument. So that's not a satisfying answer, unfortunately, but that's what we are basically working with. And so to the understandable desire to do something more, the sense that maybe we haven't done enough, that we should take further measures, I think that the obvious thing is actually to try and see what ways we can help the Ukrainians directly. So we should think much more about positive aid to the victim of aggression than only negative reprisals against an aggressor who still is much more powerful than this victim. So it'll take us much longer to break down the power of Russia than it will to bring the Ukrainians potentially up to a point where they can at least fight to things to a standstill. And those, I think, would be the sorts of situations where you could potentially see the first beginnings of a ceasefire, at least some sort of humanitarian possibilities that will reduce suffering and deaths in this conflict. I do remain pessimistic politically about the fact that there now seem to be approaches that are even further apart than we were at the beginning of this conflict, right? Putin demanding nothing but the total occupation and subjection of Ukraine. And on the other hand, Ukraine now wanting immediate entry into the EU, which is an incredibly difficult and long-winded process to achieve. So those demands on both sides, I think, unfortunately mean that it will be extremely difficult to do that. But I would say let's step away only from the negative punishment impulse and actually try and think about building pathways to de-escalation. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. And that point, too, in terms of thinking about the victims as Ukrainian citizens, I think segues nicely into Professor Yeller's role in thinking about human rights and migration.
Yeah, I was going to make two comments. One directly building on what Nick just said. I think how Europe treats the refugees is going to be important, not just for the refugees, but for the conflict in Ukraine. If Europe remains united in helping the refugees, then the refugees can get going, get jobs, start to help the war effort in Ukraine by sending money back, etc. But if Europe starts to disintegrate in terms of how it treats refugees, as we saw that they did with Middle Eastern refugees from Syria and other countries in 2015, then that'll just muddy the waters further and make it more difficult to get a resolution that's satisfactory in Ukraine. The second thing I wanted to make about the refugee crisis is that this shows how interconnected we all are. We need to reinvigorate our international refugee system to help all refugees around the world, not just from Ukraine. So I hope that although we're talking about Ukraine today, we really talk about some of the larger issues that cause conflicts around the world. And we can think about ways to de-escalate those so that we have fewer conflicts in the future and fewer refugees that we need to deal with.
Thank you so much to everyone. With that, I want to thank as well our audience, and with a particular thanks to our live viewing audience in the Statler and for the questions that you've submitted. Thank you to our expert panelists for your wise remarks and sharing your knowledge of the situation. And for all of our listeners in the Cornell community, students, faculty, and staff, please stay tuned to the Einaudi Center. We will be organizing a listening session for those of you who are working through all of this and for whom you feel very impacted. And we'll be sharing information from other partners across campus as well who are organizing different ways of coming together in this time. Thank you all so much. Have a good evening.